All right, let's get started. Okay, so I've had there are two types of developers. Let's identify them as Group A and Group B. Group A are talkative. They talk a lot. You know, when they are communicating with their client or their project managers or whoever is in leadership that they report to, they talk a lot. You know, they talk about the business, how the feature they are working on is related to the business and the rest. That's for Group A. And then Group B are developers who are not too talkative. They are not too chatty. They just take a task, go to their quiet spot, work on it, and deliver it. And the only time they have to talk is probably during stand-ups or during sprint planning or during demos, or when they're helping their teammates out. That is when they talk. Now, which one are you? If you are Group A, kind of developers who are chatty, can I see your hands? Oh, we have 3. Now, if you are Group B, the one who just takes a task, work on it, and deliver. Raise your hands. Oh. Well, the truth is majority of developers are on that Group B side. We just want to take a task, work on it, and deliver. And some of us, we choose this career because it gives us the opportunity to work and not being chatty, right? But if you are among the majority of developers on Group B, well, today I have bad news for you. And I also have good news for you. Now, what's the bad news? Okay. Supposed to be red. Domain-driven design is the bad news. I know you're confused right now. How? Well, let me tell you the good news too. That's in green. Domain-driven design is also the good news. So domain-driven design, to sum it up, domain-driven design helps developers. It takes developers from that non-chatty group and throw them into the Group A where they become chatty, where they have to talk. And not just talk, they talk a lot about the business. So in my talk today, I am going to talk about first what domain-driven design is. We're going to break domain-driven design down, make it clearer, and we'll see how we can use it for projects with various sizes and complexities. There's a talk that domain-driven design is only for complex products, but we'll see how we can use it for various sizes of products, even smaller products. And we'll see how it can help developers who are not naturally talkative in terms of their career and business-wise, right? So first off, let me introduce myself. I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm a business-focused software engineer. I'm proficient in mobile and full-stack web development, and I'm a mentor with Google African Developer Scholarship Program. I'm a member of the CST Society, Cardiff Society, Computer Society Technologies, I think, in Wales. And I do consulting in terms of helping companies with the architecture and their approach on how their software development project should go based on the business. Yeah, so you can learn more about me on my website, anayooliri.com, or you can look me up on Twitter, YouTube, or LinkedIn. Now, let's start with the very first question today, because our topic is popular questions, or Google popular questions people ask about domain-driven design. We'll use 9 questions. Through the eyes of 9 questions, we'll see what our agenda, we'll all walk through our agenda through 9 questions. So 9 selected important questions. So the first is, what is domain-driven design? I know when you hear of domain-driven design, what do you think of? Well, I've compiled 4 thoughts from people or what they think of domain-driven design, probably the first time they heard of it, including what I thought about it the first time I heard of it. These are 4 of it. First, people think domain-driven design, which is also DDD, an acronym, is complex. People feel domain-driven design has a steep learning curve, which can be true because there are a lot of things attached to it. There are a lot of a lot of terminology, aggregates, entities, value objects. It's all bubbling and overwhelming to think of. People think domain-driven design, there's not enough guidance. And because of that, people feel they don't want to approach it or, try to apply it to any project so that they don't make any mistake and later regret it or jeopardize a product, right? And truly, there are so many resources online, but many of them are not clearly explained, right? And people feel domain-driven design, they stick to their approach. Probably they still use agile methodology or feature-driven development, and it works for them. It has been working for them. And so they feel, why should I use another development approach when I still have something that works for me? In fact, even jumping to a development approach that is entirely different in terms of mindset, in terms of the approach, or how it's entirely different from other methodologies. And so they just stick to what they know since it works for them. So these are some of the reasons why people or what people think about domain-driven design, right? But let's see what domain-driven design really is. We'll see how it works. And so first off, let's start with what we know. Domain-driven design. We know domain, right? We also know design. But let's start with domain. What is domain? Well, there is a Google definition of domain. Domain is an area of territory owned or controlled by a particular ruler or government. Emphasis on area, territory, controlled. So it's not a general area, it's a specific area that is controlled by a particular group of people or particular person, right? Now, in software perspective, what is domain-driven design? This is my definition. Domain-driven design is the problem space that a software is being developed to address. That is domain-driven design. It's the problem space. Just as an area controlled by a ruler or government, domain-driven design is also, domain is also a problem space, is a particular space that a software is developed to address. Not the entire space, but a particular space. Now, let's use examples of domain, right? Let's use examples of domain from a software perspective. Facebook app or Facebook social media application. What is the domain? Social media. Facebook was developed to address the social media problem space. Fintech application. What is the domain? Finance. Every fintech application or bank application is developed to address the finance problem space. How about a shipping product like Amazon or shopping product like Amazon, for instance? What is the domain? E-commerce. Now let's try this one out together. DHL, shipping product. What do you think the domain is? Huh? Someone say carrier, delivery. Yeah. Logistics. I think it's all mean the same. Yeah. But the word they use for it is logistic. So logistic is the domain for a shipping product. That is the problem space it's developed to address. Now let's look a bit more. Each domain has context, like the characteristics or the requirements of that problem space. Yeah, like a specific area aspect of the domain. And each area has a specific focus. Now, I know this is a lot. Now, let's break this down to what are examples of context in terms of the domain we've seen so far. Let's start with social media, for instance. What is the context of a social media domain? We have user profile, you post, likes, comments, messaging. Those are contexts. Those are areas, specific areas of social media domain. Right? The characteristics of social media domain. How about e-commerce domain? What is the context? Customer accounts, product catalog, shopping cart, payment gateway, order fulfillment. These are specific characteristics of e-commerce domain. or e-commerce problem space. Now, let's move a bit further and take a very close look at each context, right? Because they will bring them together and see what domain-driven design really means. Let's look at each context. Let's take, for instance, our shopping product. Let's take product catalog, for instance. Product catalog involves a lot of things, right? There are a lot of processes in product catalog alone. Like when it comes to inventory management, listing of product, image of the product, price of the product, probably. You know, a lot of things are, on that product catalog alone, there are a lot of processes that are involved. A company like Amazon, for instance, has a department that handles product catalog alone. That department has a team. That team has a manager that oversees that department. And that manager is experienced professionally. He understands what is involved, and that is why he's handling that part as a manager. And that is the same for customer accounts, shopping carts, payment gateway, order fulfillment. Each of them are departments, because they are brain on their own. They have their own processes, right? So that is the same. Each context is a brain on its own. It has its own processes, right? It has its own specific purpose, and it has a manager, person who is experienced and who oversees that context or that department. Let's use department. Now, let's bring this all together. What is now domain-driven design, right? We've seen from what domain is. We've seen like domain has context, and we've seen that each context is a brain on its own. Now let's bring them all together. What is domain-driven design now? So this is my definition, quick one. Domain-driven design is a software development approach where developers break down business domain into context, understand what and how each context works, and build software on those contexts. You get that? So in domain-driven design, you have to identify the domain, identify the context, by breaking down that domain into context, and then try to understand those contexts. And where do you understand those contexts? The manager who oversees that department understands that department because he's experienced. So he knows how that department works. So he is the person who can better explain how that department works. Like we use product catalog or Amazon, for instance. A product catalog manager can explain how a product catalog works. So that is the same principle that applies to domain-driven design. We'll see more of it as we go on. But as we go on, there are some phrases or terms in domain-driven design that we use. For instance, when we say context, we are talking about bounded context. In domain-driven design, it's called bounded context. We mentioned managers for a particular context. They are known as domain experts. I call them context expert because it's clearer. So you can probably many articles refer to them as domain experts. They are the people who oversees that department, who understands that context very well. Now, so this is the diagram I included in the slides. So you identify the domain. Each domain has one or many bounded contexts. And each context has a domain expert, a manager, who understands that context, right? And can better explain that context. So if you bring development into this, it means that if you have a team of developers, in domain-driven design, you are sharing, you break that team into whatever groups and assign them each context. So each team belongs to one context, and then they have to understand, because the process is to understand the context and then build the software on that understanding. So they have to meet the domain experts directly and have that domain expert explain the context, and then they can build on top of it. there's an experience I have about this. Like, there's a government product I worked on one time. Is a state government project, and government project has several departments, right? And so our team, our project manager, they've given us like a document of the requirements. It's just a summary of the requirements. We developers, we feel like, okay, this is clear. This is okay. We can do this, right? And the first thing we started thinking of is technology to use. We are thinking of technology to use. We have like senior engineers in the team as well. So there are people who we brought about plans of what to do, and we even used microservices for deploying. Like, we separated those departments and deployed them like self-deployed services for each of the department. And we thought we were doing something really good, right? But something happened. The legislature changed. And so one service was affected. And that service, we had to rewrite that service, or we had to change a lot of things in that service. But because at first, when we started the product, we assumed we understood how each department works. We assumed we understood how each department works. And because of that assumption, we were creating some of the features that are in service. For instance, service A, in our microservice A, supposed to be in microservice B. As a government feature, it's supposed to be in microservice B. Some of the features in microservice C are supposed to be in microservice A. And because of that, they were a little bit of some things that are supposed to be here are in another service. And so when things changed, because we didn't understand, we implemented it that way. When things changed, it affected other services. And so when we were trying to rewrite that particular service that was affected, it was still breaking more changes, like more things were breaking in every service. So we had to rewrite the entire thing, which is very disappointing. So if we had used domain-driven approach, which we later used, right? That was where I learned domain-driven design. I learned it the hard way, which we later used. We had to break each department down as usual, as we did before. But what we did further was to understand how each department works, not what that department does, but how it works. And understanding how it works helped us to build something that, even though there's a huge change, it won't affect other services, because we understand that this is how this department is supposed to work. And so it doesn't affect how other departments work. It won't add a feature that's supposed to be in one department in another department. So that helped us. So we can do the same. It's the same with the domain-driven approach. You break down domain into context and address the domain expert for that context, understand it, and build on top of it, or build on top of the understanding. Now, the second question, what are the goals of domain-driven design? Well, there are three goals. There are other goals though, but these are three important ones. Domain-driven design focus on the business needs, the needs of the business. So developers, instead of focusing on technology as the first thing, because that is developers normally, that is what we do, right? When we have a problem, the next thing we start thinking of is database to use, or what programming language to use, or what front-end stuff to use, or we start doing UI design. But in DDD, you don't do that. You don't think about technology. That is why it's a different approach. You think about the business first. Understand the business needs. How does this business work? And you can only do that when you ask relevant questions to the domain experts. So back to that government product I worked on, asking questions, relevant questions, or deep questions about the business can be very difficult. I remember when after we realized that our approach was bad, the approach we used was bad, we started using, integrated, we had to put in domain-driven design, we had to learn it in ourselves, and we had to start using that approach. And I remember the first thing we did, because we broke ourselves into teams, the team I was working on, or the team, I and my teammates, we were on a call with one of the department executive team of the government product. And we were asking questions. And they were a bit reluctant to tell us how they work, right? They were a bit reluctant, and probably they felt that we want to take their job or something, because we're asking those questions. We're like, we want to take their job. But I had to tell them, hold on, right? We are here to make your work easier. And we can't make your work easier if we don't know how you work. So you have to tell us how you work so we can make your job easy. So that thought alone gave them a relaxed, calm mind to know that we are trying to build something that works, that helps make their job easier. And they give us answers, good answers to the questions we were asking. And that project was approved later on because we follow that approach, right? So it's the same application. Ask questions, relevant questions, right? Sometimes we developers feel that a particular product, we have experience on it, probably in e-commerce. I've worked on e-commerce before, I've built it, so it's something I can do. Why should I be asking questions again? This is something I've done before, right? Let me do it the same way. At least this is the feature they want, this is the feature they want, this is the feature they want. And then we build something that the user or the particular user audience does not need, right? Or sometimes we feel that when we ask too much questions, the client might feel we are not experienced enough, right? That we're not experienced enough. And sometimes they feel like that we are not experienced enough. And they might, if you keep asking, they might, okay, probably lay you off because they feel you're not experienced enough, right? But it's a good thing. Really, if they lay you off, it's a good thing because you've saved yourself a future headache of working on a product that won't make it to production, or working on a product that will make it to production and not be successful, right? Think about it. You've worked for 6 months on a product and it goes to production, but it's not successful. The past 6 months, you've debugged, you wasted so many hours debugging, even though they paid you enough money for that product, you've wasted hours debugging a product that wasn't successful. It's the feeling is very, very disappointing, isn't it? Really disappointing. So we want to save ourselves that stress or that headache. Ask relevant question. If a good employer will know a good employer will know a good employee, right? And you save yourself that stress. So that's the first goal of DDD. It helps you focus on the business needs. Another goal is DDD use commonly used language. Most articles use ubiquitous. That term is very, very huge, really. Sometimes when we read that word, it's kind of overwhelming, it's scary. But the meaning is commonly used language in a domain. So one thing domain-driven design does is it encourages developers to use common language across the organization, across departments in the organization, not just developers, other departments, sales department, finance department, they all use one language, even right down to the code they write, even right down to the code developers write. So take, for instance, if I tell you, save this in the database, as developers, you might ask me, okay, what database are you using? Is it SQL or non-SQL, right? Or if I said SQL, is it Postgres? Or what other database are you using? You understand that I'm talking about a software kind of, that kind of database, right? But if you tell that same thing, this same statement, tell that or author that same statement to a sales representative, they won't see it that way, right? You'll probably see it as an Excel sheet while you are saying something entirely different. So domain-driven design helps bridge that gap so that sales department or any other department across the organization, even stakeholders, when you author a word, you understand what you are saying, right? So that is one goal of domain-driven design. The third goal is it brings business closer to developers. So stakeholders and businesses are closer. They work closely together. So there's this one thing, domain-driven, like the project I worked on, the government product I worked on, it helped. What it did was, because formally we have a product manager, right, that manages the product whom we report to most of the time, who are assigned tasks. But we were directly, he was the one coordinating everything, but we were directly speaking with the government, our government department, executive in that department. We're directly speaking to them because we don't want a middleman. The middleman might interpret it differently. So you have to directly speak to the domain expert. So for you to do that, you have to work closely with the business, whoever, it's like saying working with the business. You work closely with the business, whoever or expert or whoever is you're working with. So that's the 3 goals of domain-driven design. There are other goals, though, I said before. Now, question number 3, popular question number 3 is, what problems does domain-driven design solve, right? So there are 3 problems that I've included that domain-driven design solve. The same, there are so many other problems, but these are like important ones. Unclear business requirements. So like I said before, domain-driven design helps you focus on the business first before the technology. So when you focus on the business first, you understand how the business works. You know what the business wants because you've asked relevant questions. And when it comes to complex business logic, domain-driven design helps when you have when you're working on a project that has very complex logic. Domain-driven design helps you break that product into context, right? You've broken it down, and now you're addressing each component or each context individually. Also known as separation of concern, SOC. So that is the logic that domain-driven design enforces. Also, it helps like bridge communication gaps between developers and stakeholders. I said this before. It bridge gaps between them. They better understand the business requirements. Stakeholders better understand the software. Now, the 4th question, when can I use domain-driven design approach? When can I use it? So there are 2 ways you can use domain-driven design. First, you can use it for a project with complex logic. So a product that the logic is very complex, or the complex work behind the scenes is something you don't see, but it works, right? For instance, like you can look at the image, probably most applications like web applications, for instance, most of the logic are on the backend side, right? And huge logic on the backend side. And what the user sees or was on the front end is just, what communicates with the backend. Just an interpretation, what takes data from the front end and just sends it to the backend, and the backend does all the logic. So if it's a product that has very complex logic, it could be in the front end, it could be in the back end, but if it's something that users don't see, that works on its own, you can use domain-driven design approach. So aside from the complex logic, if the business concept is complex, you can also use domain-driven design approach. If it's a very complex business with very complex logic. For instance, finance, banking, for instance, when you transfer money to someone, you click a button, probably like 3 buttons, and whatever happens, you don't know. Well, something happens behind the scenes, you can't see. There are a lot of things that happens, a lot of calculations that happens, a lot of checks that happens before it gets to the other person. A lot of those works behind the scene. So domain-driven design can work in that kind of scenario, right? Yep. And games, for instance, another example, games. There are some games that the logic works behind the scene, and a lot of complex logic. You can use domain-driven design approach. Another way you can use domain-driven design approach is for non-complex projects or projects that are small. But the thing is, in these cases, you are not using, sometimes you don't have to apply the entire domain-driven design techniques, right? You don't have to apply the entire thing. We'll see the entire thing as we go on, but you don't have to apply the entire thing. Sometimes you can apply just one technique from domain-driven design onto your product. I'll give you an instance. There are two instances where I used one technique of domain-driven design, like pick one technique of domain-driven design on my product. One of them is a small product. It's a very small product, but the business is something I don't really understand. I have to understand the business first. So I used the principle or the technique of, breaking down the business into context, trying to understand how each context works. I used just that technique alone on the product. Another case is where I was working with it's a big team, it's a collaborative team, but we had an issue. Our communication with our stakeholders were not working out properly because we're using, the project was getting larger and larger, and there were more people coming in, and because of that, we were using communication. Some of our developers were using like development technical terms when describing certain things. It was making things difficult, and so I had to suggest we bring in the common language technique of domain-driven design. So we created like a dictionary of common language. We all came together, come up like a dictionary of common words we should use for common phrases around our domain. And whenever we probably send an email and we mention one of those words, we can reference it on that document. And whoever takes that document will understand what we are saying without coming to ask us, right? So we can take one technique from domain-driven design and apply it to our product, or we can take multiple techniques and apply it to our product. We need to apply the whole thing. So it means that we can use DDD even in any kind of product, even in small products, right? Or non-complex products. But there is a catch. Not all products you use domain-driven design. Sometimes there are some products that it might just be a waste of time and effort, right? It's an approach, of course, but there are several approaches that might work best for that product instead of domain-driven design. For instance, products that are technically complex, domain-driven design might not be the best approach, right? Because you need to get domain experts, right? And probably it's a business, but the business has a complex technical part, and the domain expert does not understand, he's a business person, does not understand technicalities. So there's no point in, like, it would be very difficult, for him to understand the technical part of where you're coming from. And, business side, there's no help there. So in technical complex products, it's better not to use domain-driven design approach. You can use other approach, right? There are several approaches you can use for technical complex product. Okay, the fifth question is, what is the relation between domain-driven design and microservices, right? This is a good question, really. So domain-driven design is you breaking down the business domain into context, really, that's a mistake. Trying to understand the context and build on those understanding. But microservices is different. Microservices is breaking down systems into small, independently deployable services that will communicate with each other. Domain-driven design is a design approach. Microservices is an architecture. DDD is not an architecture. DDD is a design approach. What is the difference between OOP, object-oriented programming, and domain-driven design? Well, object-oriented programming tells you how you write your code, right? But domain-driven design is a design approach. It doesn't tell you, it has nothing to do with how you write your code. How you write your code has nothing to do with domain-driven design approach. Now, how can I implement domain-driven design? So if you want to implement the full domain-driven design, how can you implement it? Well, there are 9 steps I follow whenever I'm applying domain-driven design. The first step is identify the domain. What is the domain? Right? Is it a social media, an e-commerce, finance, whatever? The second step is to identify the bounded context. What are the bounded contexts of that domain? Break that domain down. What are the bounded contexts? Right? What are the characteristics? What are the requirements? And then find a domain expert for that context, right? So there are some times when you might not, in the company alone, you might not find somebody who is experienced enough on that particular context. It might be better to employ and get probably an external consultant to help out, fill that gap, right? And understand from those domain experts, how that context works. You ask relevant questions, understand how it works, not what it does, but how it works, the step-by-step of how it works. And then I model my domain. Now, this is the very complicated, part can be complex, really. So how do I model, how can you model your domain? So there are 4 steps. You identify the entities and value objects, create the aggregates, create the domain service or layers, create the repositories. Now, how can you identify entities and value object? Or what is entities and what is value object? Let's look at that. So entity is an object with an identity, is an ID, or an array of objects with an ID that can be modified frequently. So an object that has an ID, or an array of object that has an ID that is frequently modified, is an entity. Value object is an object without an ID that cannot be modified, or cannot be modified often, frequently, probably once in a long time, right? Now, what's an example of an entity? Okay, I think that was too fast. Okay, let's use a practical example to describe an entity, right? Let's say for our shopping product, we identify that this domain is an e-commerce domain. One of the bounded contexts we identify is order management, right, for that e-commerce. And we've conversed with our domain expert. He told us what they collect from users. They collect their full name, for each product they bought, the total amount, the currency. Each product has the name, price, and quantity. They also collect from the user country, city, street, postcode, and house number information. Let's say this is an example of what the domain expert gave to us, right? Now let's create an entity and a value object from this information that he has given us. So remember, entity has an ID, can be modified. Value object does not have an ID and cannot be modified or can be modified frequently. Now, here's an example of an entity. So remember, he gave us name that the users can add products, right? Users can add products. The product includes the name, the price, and quantity. And if we think about it, how frequently when users go to a website and then a shopping or an e-commerce website and then they add product to their cart. Sometimes they take out the product, right? They take out product they've added before and add new product, or they update the quantity of the product they want. So it keeps they can keep updating that product. Right? They can keep updating, keep adding, keep removing, keep adding, keep removing. So which means that for them to add or for them to modify an object, let's say they want to modify, they've added a product to their cart and then they want to modify a particular quantity, right? They want to change the quantity. We need the ID of that product to change the quantity, right? So, which means it will need an ID. So we've identified an entity like that. So which means our product array of products is an entity. So product is an entity. And we can then do a rough, we are not writing code, per se yet, but you can do a rough writing of how you will write out, or how some of the methods you will use for your code, and based on the entity you've just identified, right? For instance, we had a class with several properties, and we have a getter. So we have a setter in our class. I didn't add, there was no space. I didn't add the getter. So you can add getters, you can add setters, whatever structure you want to use. We are just doing a rough description or modeling of how we will go about, or methods we will use for our entity or whatever, right? But the thing is, this is part of modeling, and this is part of it's part of the whole identifying your entity. So once you identify your entity, you think about how will this entity work? What's the relationship? We'll have to set an ID. We'll have to set a name. We'll have to set a price. How do we update? When they need to update the quantity, how will we update the quantity? How would we do that in the code, right? You just have to do a rough code sample of how it will be and document it. Now, how about value object? So from the information our domain expert gave us, we can identify two value objects. One is total. Total has, so he gave us that we have, he collects the amount and the currency. So we created that into total, because amount and currency have to work together, right? So we put them in an object. And why is this a value object? So amount only holds one object, right? We don't need to have multiple amounts for a particular, once users create a particular order, we don't have to have multiple amounts. It's just one amount, right? So one amount, and because of that, we don't have to modify. We are not like modifying. We don't have like loads of array of objects that we have to modify, and then we'll need an ID in order to modify one of the objects. So because of that, we don't have an ID, right? But if you think about it, we'll need to, sometimes users might add a new product and we need to update the price, right? The total price, right? So how do we do that? Remember in value object, either you cannot modify, or you can when you modify, you don't modify it frequently. Our total, we are not modifying it. So when there's a new amount or a new total amount, what we are doing is we are creating a new instance. You are creating a new instance, and because it doesn't have an ID, so we're not like updating the contents inside of the object. What we are doing is we are creating a new instance, a new object on its own, and replacing it. So when there's a new amount or a new update on the amount, we're creating a new instance of total, or new instance, or new object instance, and we are replacing it with whatever is in there. So it's a new object, right? Same with address too. So if we think about it, address to users does not move around a lot. So we can think about that too as a value object. Probably it might be once in a while they would have to change their address. And another thing is, when we have to update, if there's a time we have to update this address, we won't be updating it. We won't update country alone, or city alone, or street alone. We would have to update everything. We'd have to take out that array, that object. It's like deleting that object and creating a new instance of address. So you are creating a new object on it. So you are not like modifying anything there. You are creating a new object. So that is why it's a value object. Something without an ID, you can't update its individual inside. You have to create a new instance of it. So here is an example of we writing like a rough code of how our value objects will interact with each other, right? Here we have properties, and this is our class. We have properties, and we have the add method, and what the add method should do, like a rough idea of how the add method should work, and that is how we can structure or model that value object, or any of those value objects, right? Now, that's for value object and entities, right? Now, let's look at aggregates. We have to create aggregates now based on the value object and entities we've identified. Now, what are aggregates in domain-driven design? They are the way we group entities and value objects that have a strong relationship or common life cycle, and then we define the rule of interaction between them. So in aggregates, we look at entities, we look at the objects, value objects we've created. Which one are related? Which one will have to interact with each other? For instance, our product entity, we identified product, really, total and address value object. They share a common life cycle, right? For example, when users add a new product, we have to update the total. So they are interacting with each other. And then once user create an order, we'd have to ship it to their address, the address they provided. So we'd have to interact. Address is part of it. So address is also connected to whatever products we are creating or entities that we have, or the aggregates we've grouped entities and value objects together with. I hope it's cool. Okay. So here's an example of other aggregates and how we think of interacting, creating their interaction, the value object and entities interaction, right? This is an example. You can see in our class order, we have several properties. We have add item, get total, add item to the cart, get total of items we've created. How each entity should interact with each other is an aggregate. So get order, class order is an aggregate, right? We've just modeled an aggregate. So that's like just do a rough model of the aggregate. You're not actually writing any code yet. You're just modeling. Now, how about the domain service layers? So you also have, after you've created aggregates, you have to create your domain service. What are domain service? Domain service is the business logic. So this is like the brain of your domain-driven design. This is where your business logic, or the rules of the domain lives. All the algorithms or how this should work and how this should work, this is where you create them. Domain service is what handles that operations, right? For example, our domain expert informs us that users need to search for products. They need to search for product, add product to cart, check out, and then calculate total price, right? So the order management, the domain service layers would have to, handle that operations, how that operations will work, how the flow of that operations will work, will live on the domain layer. Here's an example: product service, order service. Product service gets product, create product, update product, delete product. Order service creates order, gets order, delete order. That is how the operations will go, how the operations will work. This is a domain layer, right? Modeled domain service or domain layer. And now the last part of modeling your domain is repositories. So what are repositories? Repositories is like the middleman between your database and your domain layer. It's because your domain layer have to save data, right? You have to push data to the database. But your domain layer does not talk with your database. It's your repositories that handles all the operations that communicates with your database. So why this is very efficient is because once the database changes or operations changes, it doesn't affect your domain layer, right? Your domain layer is separate, entirely separate from your repositories. So any changes doesn't affect other part of the domain. You only have to update your repositories only. Now, there's an example of repositories. We have product repository. Yeah, it gets order by ID, gets all, updates, deletes. All these are SQL queries. Right? This is an example of repositories. These are communicating directly to the database directly. So once you have modeled your domain like that, you then create a common language across the domain. So the next thing on how you can implement driven design, you then create a common language, right? Why you should do this after you've modeled your domain, because now you have a proper understanding of how everything works. Now you can create a common language among, common language. So you bring all the teams together, like probably a representative of each department, and let them come together and think about, what language we should use in this case, and so that everybody can understand, document it, and even write down to your code. When you start writing your code, use that same languages, right? Now, the sixth step is you can now set up your database, think about technology right now, and start coding, right? So this is where you can start coding right now. Now, this part, step 7, this is like the very most important part when it comes to domain-driven design. Unlike Agile, where you have to probably like 7 day sprint, or sorry, like 5 day sprint, or 6 day or 4 day sprint. In domain-driven design, the feedback loops is very, very short. It can be in 2 days, it can be in 1 day. So all you have to do, how it works is you have to do code, whatever you're doing, you have to do it small and demo it to your domain expert. So you code small, a very small batch of code, demo that solution to your domain expert, let your domain expert review it or approve it. If he rejects it, you have to go back and rework on it again and re-demo it again to your domain experts. If he approves it, then you can then deliver that approved batch to production as production code, right? You can then take that approved part, put it to production, and work on the next one and do the same thing, code, review, demo, approve or reject, and the same. And then the 9th step is to refine your model. So once you've done with the whole production thing, and then the production is ready and it's up, it's live, businesses are always changing. So which means domain layout or whatever has to be updated. And so when there's a need for the domain to be updated, there you have to refine it. You do the same step, identify the domain, identify the context of that change, who is the domain expert of that change, ask questions, model it, feedback loop, the same thing, is iterative. Now, that is the steps you can use to implement domain-driven design. So we've seen, these are like a summary of all of the steps. Now, look at the quick advantage and disadvantage of domain-driven design, the quick one. First advantage of domain-driven design is that it's flexible. You are focusing just on small individual pieces of the domain, and whatever modification has to be done, it won't change or affect other parts of the domain. It's user-oriented. There's a higher chance that, there's a higher chance that it's user-oriented and effective. I'll just take 2 and 3, is user-oriented and effective and efficient, right? So there's a higher chance that because you are building based on the needs of users, there's a higher chance that when that product goes to live, it will meet the needs of the users, right? There's a higher chance that that product might be successful. Although there are several factors that will determine it, but there is a higher chance that that product might be successful. And communication, for large products, it helps it. For large complex products or large companies, DDD helps, bridge that gap. And what are some of the disadvantage? Time. Domain, we've seen some of the 9 steps. This is a lot of time that will go into taking all those steps. So the domain design requires time, requires effort to understand the domain and model that domain. And the second disadvantage is that domain experts need to be highly experienced, right? You can't select a domain expert who is not experienced on that concept. It just forfeits the aim of domain-driven design. So the expert needs to be highly experienced on that context so that they can offer advice or offer understanding of how that context works. So that is the disadvantage and the advantage. And so So that is all. So I said 9. Sorry, it's not 9, it's 8. 8 questions. So my final words is that really the aim of we developing is to address the needs of business, right? Real world problems. Why we are building projects is to address the the needs of people, of users. So it is very important that we think of development approach to take. Very important. It's not that we don't want to pick on any approach that we feel comfortable with, or we've been working with and it has been successful. We want to think about the product, try to understand the product, what development approach will be really useful or will help or benefit this product. And after we do that, we have like a paved way, a clear way to go on with the development of that product. Yep. So that's it. Thank you. Is there any questions? I know I've taken a lot time. Really, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I apologize for that. So is there any questions on what we've discussed so far? Okay. All right then. Thank you. And have a great day.